Conversations That Matter is a partner program for the Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
Patricia Leidl, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here.
You co-authored a book called The Hillary Doctrine, and it has nothing to do with her run for the presidency. Give me a definition of what the Hillary Doctrine is.
Well, the actual full name of the book is called The Hillary Doctrine, Sex and American Foreign Policy. And it's based on the premise that Hillary Clinton herself articulated, and was certainly the first Secretary of State ever to do so, that the subjugation of women actually constitutes a threat to national and international security. And that, she's the only politician, and certainly Secretary of State, who's articulated what is basically based on 30 years of very robust surveys that show that where women are disempowered, where women particularly face high levels of violence, you're going to also see higher levels of state and non-state armed violence, higher rates of criminality, and also higher rates of autocracy.
What was it about this statement from her when she was Secretary of State that made you say, okay, we have to examine this in depth and write a book about it?
Well, it was basically a confluence of a number of different factors. I've been a former reporter. I was former editorial director of the Human Security Report and have worked in the United Nations for the last 15 years, and am currently working on a USAID project in Afghanistan. And the main thrust of my own career has been sort of looking at this nexus between the subjugation of women and armed conflict, and knowing intuitively that there was a connection there, that the subjugation of women is basically a proxy for a myriad of social and economic and cultural and security ills. And during this time, I started to work with Valerie Hudson. I first heard about her research around sex ratios in China and India, and how sex-selective abortion was leading to this demographic disaster of essentially, in some parts of India, 126 boys to every 100 females, which is unprecedented in human history.
So sex selection in India, you start there rather than China, because isn't it a problem there as well?
It is. It's in both countries, and in fact, Afghanistan and Pakistan, and it's a growing global problem. It's actually extending throughout not only the Islamic world, but in countries where women are profoundly subordinate. And basically, it's a confluence of three things: the desire for smaller families, very traditional societies where women are profoundly disenfranchised, and also the advent of cheap ultrasound technologies. And so I started to follow her research about this and incorporate it into my work around human security. And through the relationship that developed while I was working in Yemen and in Afghanistan first and then Yemen, we decided that the combination of her research, which was based on statistics and gathering data, and my experience in the field, would make for a very strong combination of a sort of data-driven but also storytelling-driven book. So first we started writing together as magazine authors for Foreign Policy and World Politics Review, or pardon me, Foreign Affairs. And then she proposed to me as Hillary Clinton, was running for, as a Secretary of State, and then as it became clear that she was going to make a presidential run, that maybe we should write a book together. Again, sort of melding her statistical experience with my on-the-ground field experience. And that's how the Hillary Doctrine was born.
How important is it that Hillary Clinton raised the issue globally, being who she is and considering the position that she's now seeking?
It's critically important because she is the first powerful female figure, and certainly the first Secretary of State, or anyone who's actually run for president, who's actually said, gender is not a soft issue. It's a critical, hard security issue. And unless we tackle this as such, we're going to find ourselves in situations that are going to, continue to involve the rise of autocracies, more and greater levels of, state and non-state sponsored terrorism, and greater instability all around. And so it was very, very important that she articulated this, because nobody had ever done it before.
But she articulated from the perspective of this becomes a security issue to the United States. And there are some people who will go, well, how, egocentric is that of the Americans to say these things are happening in the global, well, around the world, but it becomes a threat to us. Doesn't it become a threat to everyone?
It is a threat to everyone, but you also have to understand the context under which Hillary Clinton is operating, which is essentially she is running for president of a parochial superpower. Americans still, of all Western nations, they possess fewer passports. They travel less. They're less educated. And so everything, in order to appeal to an American audience, you have to appeal to so-called American parochialism. That's my view. It's not necessarily the view of my co-author, but I think, and you see this with Donald Trump, you see this with every single presidential contender, that they don't really talk about foreign policy per se, except in terms of, making America great again or inflating the threat to American borders.
Well, does the subjugation of women in the United States pose a threat to them as well?
Well, it's quite interesting. There was a recent article in the New York Times that showed that men who engage in massacres and mass murders, whether it be Timothy McVeigh or Omar Mateen in Florida, all of them have a history of domestic violence, which is quite interesting.
Yeah. I got to get you to hang on for just a second while we take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
Yeah.
So let's go to the roots of how does the subjugation of women start to lead to less productive societies, more violent societies, breeding grounds for terrorism, and how does that start to play itself out?
Okay, well, it's very, very complex and, far beyond the sort of purview of this particular interview. But basically, our thesis, and again, this is supported by evidence, 30 years worth of evidence, very robust. We're not talking about, ideology here. Mm-hmm. But essentially what happens is that the beginnings of a state more or less occur within the home. So in a society where women are profoundly, again, disenfranchised or subjugated or relegated to the status of third-class citizens, what you're going to see in a family is, a pattern of dominance whereby people, children absorb this kind of way of thinking. Brothers become the enforcers of, against their sisters. Husbands beat their wives. It becomes a pattern of it becomes an accepted way of settling disputes. And this, in turn, when there's complete impunity against domestic violence or violence against women in general, this begins to permeate a society where higher levels of violence are tolerated more generally. And this isn't just higher levels of violence against women, but also sort of outgroup males, males who are deemed to be effete, for example. Homosexuals, bisexuals, artists, writers, people who don't sort of hew to a particular ideal of masculinity that involves the use of violence and coercion to maintain order.
What is the impact on that society as far as its ability to advance, to become a more enriched environment, economically, philosophically, spiritually, if this is now at the foundation of their thinking?
Well, I mean, based on what I've also experienced personally, is that these societies become very stunted. And they become stunted, in many different ways. They become stunted economically, where you've got half the population who cannot earn a living or cannot even leave their home without permission. You've got a huge pool of talent that is unable to express itself. You're talking about higher levels of poverty within the family, usually because the mother cannot work. You're also talking about higher fertility levels because these societies where women are subordinate and only defined according to their reproductive role, they're going to have higher fertility rates, which is in turn, not only bad for women who are, pushing these babies out, but also bad for the children themselves because there are fewer resources. And it becomes a vicious cycle because in large families, in very patriarchal societies, you're going to see the first people who are going to be pulled out of school are going to be the girls. to either work at home, or they're seen as a burden, so they're married off at a young age because the family can't actually afford to keep them. In terms of security, what you also see is there's a whole amount of research also about the relationship between marriage and testosterone levels, for example, and that men who marry are more likely to experience a lowering of their testosterone level.
So when they marry, their testosterone level
when they marry,
decreases.
Yes, when they marry. So, and this is considered kind of an important rite of passage for men, and it's actually, there's a physiological changes that occur in men, the more exposed they are to female company. And again, this is very well documented. What happens in patriarchal societies, and particularly where males and women are kept separate, or where there's a large discrepancy between the demographics, the number of young boys brought into the world versus girls, is that you have this growing cohort of disenfranchised young men who cannot marry, who are lower status, who will also tend to hang out in groups.
With higher levels of testosterone.
With higher levels of testosterone. And these groups, and then nothing, insecurity, it's the trope that, young men in groups are the most dangerous.
This is our second break. We'll be back in a moment.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
Because they go from individual thinkers to group think,
That's
and
right.
they're easily
so,
manipulated.
for example, young men who live in fraternities are 700 times more likely to engage in sexual assault.
700 times?
700 times.
And that's in a fraternity.
And that's in a fraternity. And we're talking like a Western, context. This is like a frat house situation. And of course we've seen with, and I've spent time in Mexico and Guatemala researching the narco-trafficking society there, and the relationship between narco-trafficking, militarism, and femicide.
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 Which means?
It is the murder of women, but it is not just that. It's essentially categorized as a hate crime. And it's something that we don't have in North America, but has become a huge issue in Latin America because of the thousands of women that are being murdered every year, usually in the commission of sexual violence. And it's become such an epidemic that there's actually been, there's new laws that actually, basically codify these crimes as hate crimes against women, and they're called femicides because women are being murdered for no other reason than they're women. Particularly Central America, we're looking at an increase in femicides of 23% every year since 2006.
Every year?
Every year. We're talking Mexico, we're talking El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Venezuela. Caracas is now one of the most murderous cities in the world. But it's a phenomenon that's occurring throughout Latin America. And that's why human rights advocates have been pushing for the special laws that will treat the murders, particularly murders of women that involve sexual violence or domestic violence, as hate crimes.
So what happens in these countries where we see the balance between the number of women and men, as you say, getting up to 125, 126 men for every 100 women? You've got a significant portion of the population who are now, as you pointed out, roaming around with increased levels of testosterone. Does that not cause problems for authorities? And then how do they deal with it, even though they are an extension of the society that they're ruling?
Well, I'd refer the viewers to my partner's very excellent book called Bare Branches, The Implications of Sex-Selective Abortion on Security in Asia. And I may actually be misquoting the full title. But in any event, her research is based on this very notion that when you've got high proportions of males to females being born in a population, those young males will not be able to marry or find partners because there's a shortage of females. And this will be particularly intensified in polygamous societies where it's only powerful men who will be able, who marry like 4 wives, which reduces the pool of
even
females further. So what happens is that you have these large populations of young males who have nothing better to do except to cause problems, either through criminality or through insurgency through challenges to the government. You know, in India, of course, we're seeing a huge spike in levels of sexual violence, so it becomes very unsafe for women to sort of, you know, to leave their home because there's so many young men wandering around. So what you have is these large cohorts of discontented young men. They can't find wives, they're disenfranchised, and so they are more likely to foment, you know, unrest against the government, which in turn will often become more autocratic in order to sort of deal with this, you know, increasingly...
So the government becomes more violent then?
The government becomes more violent, or what they do, as in the case of China, which has been fairly intelligent about it because they have recognized in 2004 that they had a serious, serious demographic, you know, disaster waiting to happen. They've been, you know, exporting their surplus young males. You know,
they're getting them out of the country.
Yeah, they're getting them out of the country. Or as in the case of Saudi Arabia, they're exporting their jihadists in the form of, you know, and that's a whole other issue that we tackle in the book, which is, you know, how Saudi Arabia is the epicenter of global Islamic terrorism. And
you draw the link back to the subjugation of women as being at the heart of this.
Yes, yes. The subjugation of women in a country or in a particular society is a greater predictor of future armed violence and autocracy than level of wealth, inequality, poverty, and overpopulation, and even climate, you know, climate scarcity. It is the greatest predictor of whether a country is going to slip into an autocratic situation or, you know, intra or civil war or external wars.
A final break before we wrap up. We'll be back in a moment.
Conversations That Matter is a not-for-profit program made possible thanks to the charitable support of the following and from viewers like you. Please visit conversationsthatmatter.tv and help us to continue to produce this program.
So within these societies, like from my perspective, you know, I live here in this lovely place that we call Vancouver. I think, well, am I not going to have a better life if I can and have an opportunity to have a partner, a female partner, which is, I think, a part of life's path that we couple up. If I learn how to treat women nicer, better, with respect, give them access to opportunity and so on. And yet you're telling me that these groups actually bond around the idea of like further subjugation of women in the hopes that it's going to get them what they want.
In countries where you know, your bonds with your males are paramount, you're going to bond with other men through the subjugation of women. For example, you know, sexual violence in war is a huge problem. And, you know, you see men gang raping women as a form of male bonding. It's comparable.
As a form of bonding.
With each other. It's comparable to, you know, and I say this, but it's kind of true, of passing around a beer. That's what it's like. I mean, that's basically the way they think. So a woman,
it's so difficult for me to comprehend because it's so far outside of my thinking that it's hard to grasp, and it's deeply troubling, of course.
Yeah, but you know, it's not just, you know, confined to countries such as, you know, Syria or Afghanistan or India. You know, we talk, you know, I've referred earlier to the fraternity or frat houses,
right.
You know, where, you know, young men are 700 times more likely to commit a sexual assault. It's the same kind of thinking, where you've got young men who are performing for each other and bonding with each other, and those relationships are the most paramount.
Well, we're not clear of that in Canada either. If we take a look at the situation with missing and murdered Indigenous women, you have to say, why is that acceptable? Why is it that in our society we were so slow to respond to that? Are we guilty as well?
Yes, we definitely are. I mean, when you look at the situation of missing and murdered women, which from what I was reading recently, what the tally is up to 4,000, and since I can't remember when it started, but that is, you know, in terms of our population, that's pretty shocking. And the fact that most of these crimes remain unsolved, that these women were Indigenous, so an outgroup anyhow, already marginalized, that they were women, you know, is just shocking. And also the police behavior around the investigations of these crimes, which was more or less to dismiss these women as, you know, whether they were sex workers or not, to dismiss them, you know, as sex workers and therefore, you know, a second order of humanity, not worth, you know, their deaths and disappearances were not accorded the kind of investigative procedures that they required.
So what do we do about this? How do we start to turn the tide in another direction? Like, I had hoped over the last 50 to 100 years that the world was moving in a better direction, and yet so many of the trends that I see right now are troubling, despite the fact that there have been so many advances in inclusive thinking.
Well, the advances in inclusive thinking, I've noticed, don't seem to include women. There's been huge strides when it comes to, you know, gay rights, you know, LGBT rights. You know, Obama, you know, when Russia, you know, brought in new laws around, you know, the dissemination of, you know, so-called, you know, gay media or gay propaganda, he spoke out against it. And yet, you know, when other nations, you know, crack down on women's groups and women's rights or repeal their rights, there's silence from the White House altogether. So, you know, you have to wonder, you know, how much progress are being made, and why women's rights are still, you know, stalling. But I would say it has to do with the deeply entrenched nature of misogyny and gender inequality. And, you know, what we're experiencing now, I believe, in the United States is essentially a backlash.
So is it essential that all of us who care about this speak up?
Absolutely, and people don't. You know, I was teaching at Michigan State University last semester, or not last semester, about a year ago, and I found it fascinating how few of my students were willing to admit that they were feminists. And of course, you know, I did the usual thing. I defined what a feminist was, but didn't tell them that that's what a feminist was. And then I asked them, you know, so how many of you believe in, you know, that men and women should enjoy equal rights under the law and equal opportunity? Most of their hands shot up, but they would never identify as being feminist. That was somehow considered shameful and a feat. Or, you know, somehow for the young women they had this notion in their head that it involved, you know, having, you know, hair on your legs and not looking feminine. I was just shocked that those notions still persist, you know, more than 100 years after suffrage. And I think a big part of it is just that people are unwilling to speak about this issue. They're unwilling to speak about what is so fundamentally, you know, underpins, you know, basically every aspect of our society, which is the relationship between men and women in that society.
Well, the relationship between men and women is absolutely fundamental to all of us. Unfortunately, we're out of time.
Thanks
for coming
very much.
in.